And I know that one of your projects is also Conversations with the Earth. Can you tell us a little bit about your plans for these videos that are being made by indigenous peoples?
Sure. Conversations with the Earth, we began with Insight Share, an organization based in England. And there's Nicholas Viaume, who's a French photographer, has also been working with us on this. And what we've been doing is um, setting up community video hubs around the world. And what happens is the people from Insight Share go into the communities and they give them a couple of weeks of training on how to make their own videos. We get them cameras, computers, microphones, everything they need. And then, so what they've been doing is making their own, telling their own stories through video on how climate change is affecting them and how they are adapting. And it's a project that's developed very quickly. As you know, last year at COP15 in Copenhagen, there was a pretty major exhibit at the National Museum of Denmark, and they actually kept that on from December of last year till October of this year. The exhibit has also been shown at the U.S. Social Forum, at the Cochabamba Conference on Climate Change in Bolivia, and leading up to this conference, it's been traveling throughout communities in every state in Mexico with these caravans that showed up last week. And now we're continuing the project. We're setting up more video hubs. We've started trainings with indigenous communities on them telling their stories through photography. And in July of next year, it will be opening at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., which is pretty exciting.
It's part of the Smithsonian.
Yeah, and they estimate that it'll be there, I think, 7 months, and they estimate that somewhere around 1 million people will come see it. So we're developing educational materials for school groups that will visit the museum, and we'll be bringing indigenous peoples who have been making these films to Washington for the opening, and they'll be presenting their own films, and we'll also do a series of events around Washington to highlight the issue of climate change and highlight the role that indigenous peoples can play in finding solutions.
Yeah, I've seen a few of the videos, and they're very powerful because it really hits home that climate change is impacting their way of life.
Yeah, I think, like I said, they're very dependent on their environments, so they suffer the impacts of climate change before the rest of the world, really.
They're on the front lines.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, they contribute least to climate change. They don't have economies based on fossil fuels. They don't have economies based on profit. They have economies that are based on reciprocity with their lands and territories. And actually, they are sort of getting a double whammy here with climate change, because not only are they affected by the process of climate change, but also by the proposed solutions by governments, World Bank, and others. Carbon
And
trading.
RED, which is a scheme to give incentives to stop deforestation and degradation.
Yeah, and RED is a contentious issue. Some indigenous peoples see it as a potential benefit. Others see it as a threat. And we know that so far it hasn't, the process hasn't been going so well. RED was developed without input from indigenous peoples. RED agreements, areas where there will be RED projects, the peoples have to sign long-term agreements, usually 99 years, which limits their access to their resources in these areas. So unless the critique is that unless RED recognizes the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples and is actually implemented in a way that is in sync with the UN Declaration, unless RED recognizes free, prior, and informed consent, which means the right to also say no, and unless RED is red should be not tied to markets at all, carbon markets. Uh, if those things aren't done, then there's really, I don't see how it could be a help to indigenous peoples. And then you also have the question of, it seems to me red was sort of invented by corporations that are emitting carbon.
And Wall Street as a way to sell their product.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, and also people who trade for a living.
And we all know what happened in the crash that just happened last year.
Yeah, yeah, and so, and the ultimate irony will be, if there's a company in Canada that's, throwing out pollution into indigenous communities in, say, in Canada, polluting their rivers and their air and causing asthma in the kids and all kinds of health problems. And
the Alberta tar sands is an example of that.
Yeah, and like they could be able to buy carbon credits, say from a rainforest in Ecuador or Costa Rica, and they wouldn't have to reduce the amount of CO2 they're throwing into the air.
It shifts the burden
it
to
does really
the indigenous.
nothing to reduce the amount of fossil fuels we're using and the amount of CO2 that companies are throwing in the air. It's sort of a shell game.
And they can continue business as usual.
Exactly. And so even if in the best case scenario, say it's a benefit to the people who are participating in red somewhere in the forest, this is if red is eventually tied to carbon markets. We don't know what's going to happen because the negotiations aren't over yet. But say they, it might be a benefit to a community in Ecuador, while at the same time it's destroying a community up north. So that has to be really looked at, and that's something that indigenous peoples are discussing in depth.
Mm-hmm. Well, while here at the Radisson, I've had an opportunity to meet many indigenous people from all parts of the world, and I think their voice has to be elevated because it is so important that their knowledge and their traditional knowledge be respected and honored, and we can even learn from it.
Yeah, actually, if you, whether we're talking about climate change or biodiversity, the solutions, new technologies are going to help solve the crisis of climate change, hopefully. Market mechanisms, probably not. But what we know is that in order to maintain the climatic stability of the planet as best we can, we need to preserve the integrity of large landscapes, large ecosystems that still function. And today, if you look around the world, the only places where there are large landscapes that are still functioning is where indigenous peoples have managed to maintain control of their territories. So whether it's the rainforests or mountain ecosystems, island ecosystems, these people have been guarding these areas for thousands of years, and what we want to see in this UNFCCC process is that they are allowed to maintain control of their areas and continue safeguarding their territories using their traditional knowledge. And that's why it's important to really support their participation in these processes, support not only them getting to these places, but also organizing at the regional and local levels so that they can be in dialogue with their governments and present their concerns and hopes for the future and for their participation in helping governments find real solutions.
Well, thank you, Brian, for sharing your knowledge, and you're doing great work. I wish you luck.
Okay, thank you, Bing. It's been a pleasure.